The thing crossed the road at mile marker 227, and I've spent 11 years trying to convince myself it was a bear. It wasn't a bear. I'd been running the Dalton for going on 6 years at that point, Fairbanks up to Dead Horse and back, sometimes twice in a week during the busy season. You get comfortable with that road in a way that's probably not healthy. You stop seeing it. You start driving it the way you drive to the grocery store, automatic, muscle memory, your brain halfway somewhere else. That's a dangerous thing on a road that will kill you for a lapse of 3 seconds. I knew that. I'd seen what it did to guys who forgot it. But that night, somewhere north of Coldfoot, I was comfortable, tired, running on black coffee and a breakfast sandwich I'd bought 6 hours earlier at the truck stop diner on Cushman before the sun. What passed for sun in late October had even thought about showing up. It was 3:17 a.m. I know the exact time because I looked at the dash clock about 40 seconds before it happened, thinking about whether I should pull over at the Coldfoot Camp truck bay and grab 2 hours. I decided against it. 40 seconds later, I wish I hadn't. My headlights caught it at maybe 200 feet. It was crossing the road, walking, if you want to call it that, from the east shoulder to the west, moving left to right across my lane. And my first thought, my instant, automatic, completely confident first thought was moose, because that's what crosses the Dalton at 3 a.m. Moose, caribou, the occasional wolf, if you're unlucky. Your brain reaches for the familiar. It does that. It's supposed to do that. But it wasn't a moose. It was on 2 legs. Now, I know what you're thinking, because it's what I thought immediately after. Somebody walking the road, a hiker in trouble, or somebody whose vehicle had broken down further up and they were walking toward Coldfoot. It happens. Not often and not at 3 a.m. in late October when it's -14, but it happens. So I'm already reaching for that explanation, already decelerating, already thinking about pulling over and rolling down the window, and then I notice the height. The thing is, the Dalton is flat along that particular stretch, flat and straight for about a quarter mile before a long, gradual bend. My headlights are good. I'd replaced the entire lighting rig the previous spring, LED conversion, throw a strong beam a solid 300 feet. And the thing I was looking at was tall enough that my lights caught it from the chest down before they caught it from the chest up. That doesn't make sense until you do the math. A 6-foot person at 200 feet fits inside a standard headlight beam with room to spare. This thing, whatever I was looking at, had its lower half fully illuminated and its upper half, its head and shoulders, catching the very top edge of my beam. I am 5'11". My headlights aimed right, clear my height by a comfortable margin at distance. Whatever this was stood somewhere around 8 to 9 feet tall. I've told myself for 11 years it was a trick of light, atmospheric distortion. The cold does strange things to how you perceive distance and proportion. I've read that, I've believed that, I've used that, but I watched it move across the full width of my lane. I had maybe 4 seconds of clear visual before it reached the west shoulder and stepped into the tree line. And in those 4 seconds, 2 things stuck into my brain like fish hooks that I have never been able to pull out. The first thing, it moved wrong. Not wrong like injured. Wrong like the mechanics of how it moved had been designed by something that had only been told about walking and had never actually seen it. The knee articulation was, I don't know how to say this without sounding like I've lost my mind. It was too much. Too much bend, too deep, like every step was a full compression and release. Like watching a person walk in slow motion but at regular speed. The second thing, it did not react to my headlights at all. You put 200 feet of headlights on a person at 3 a.m. on a pitch-dark road and they react. Every animal reacts. The eye shine, the freeze, the flinch. This thing crossed my lane like my lights weren't there. Like I wasn't there. Like it was on a road it had been walking for 1,000 years and my truck was nothing but a brief inconvenience in weather it had no opinion about. I did not stop. I want to be honest about that. I slowed. I think I hit maybe 15 miles an hour as I passed the spot where it had crossed, and I looked into the tree line on the west shoulder, and I saw nothing. Just black spruce and darkness and the edge of my headlights losing the fight against the Alaskan night. I didn't stop. I didn't pull over. I turned my music off, which I don't know why I did, and I drove. Here's the part I don't tell people. 22 miles north of that spot, there's a wide gravel pullout on the east side of the road. Truckers use it to check loads, take a leak, stretch. I've used it 100 times. As I came around the long bend that feeds into that pullout, my headlights swept across it, and I saw something standing at the far edge, where the gravel meets the brush line. I want to be very precise here. I had driven 22 miles. At the speed I was going, I'd come back up to about 45 after the encounter. That's somewhere between 25 and 30 minutes of driving. The road between that crossing point and that pullout is not a straight shot. There are bends, a short climbing section, a creek drainage crossing where the road narrows. There is no path through the trees that runs parallel. I know that road. I've driven it hundreds of times. Whatever I had seen crossing the road 22 miles back was standing at the edge of that pullout. I know I can't prove that. I know that. I couldn't see it clearly. It was at the outer edge of my headlight range, partially obscured by the brush. But the height was the same, the proportions were the same, and it was facing me, not crossing, not moving. Just standing at the edge of the light, facing the direction I was coming from. I did not slow down. I want to tell you I gunned it out of fear, some dramatic pedal-to-the-floor moment, but the truth is I just didn't slow down. I maintained speed. I kept my eyes on the road ahead. I passed that pullout at 45 miles an hour, and I did not look directly at it, and I did not look in my mirror after I passed. That last part, not looking in the mirror, was a decision I made consciously in the half-second I had to make it. I can't fully explain the logic except to say that somewhere in the part of my brain that is older than language, there was an absolute certainty that looking in that mirror was the wrong move. That some things, once you've looked away from them, need to stay looked away from. I pulled into the Dead Horse Terminal at 6:44 a.m. I sat in the cab for a while before I went in. I don't know how long. It was still dark. It's always dark in Dead Horse in October. And I sat there with the engine running and the heat going, and I tried to think through what I'd seen in a way that made it something normal. I couldn't. I've got a guy I run with, been on the Dalton almost as long as me, and I almost told him that morning over coffee in the terminal canteen. I had the words ready. But I looked at him sitting there across a formica table in a warm room under fluorescent lights. And I thought about what it would sound like out loud, and I just asked him if he'd heard about road conditions south of Coldfoot instead. He said he'd heard it was fine. I drank my coffee. We talked about the load pricing changes and whether the weather window was going to hold through Thursday. I never told him. The thing is, and this is the part that keeps it alive in me after all these years, keeps it from settling into something I can file away as a weird night and move on. I talked to a driver 2 summers later who ran the Dalton out of a different company, guy I met at the Yukon River Camp fuel stop. We were talking the way you talk with other Dalton drivers, and he mentioned mile marker 227. He didn't know I knew that number. He just said he'd had something happen near there that he couldn't explain. He said it in the way people say things when they've been waiting a long time to say them to the right person. I asked him what kind of thing. He said he'd seen something crossing the road. I asked him when. He thought about it. Said it was October, going on 3 years back. That would have been the same month. Maybe not the same night. I don't know. He wouldn't say more and I didn't push him. We fueled up and we both drove north and we didn't talk about it again. I've been back past mile marker 227 more times than I can count since then. Daytime, nighttime, all seasons. Nothing. Empty road, black spruce, the ordinary dark. But I haven't used that pullout 22 miles up since the night it happened. I've needed to stop on that stretch. I've passed it needing to stop. I just keep driving until the next one. I don't have an explanation for what I saw. I've made my peace with not having one. What I haven't made my peace with is the thing I decided in that half second. To not look in the mirror. And whether it was instinct or whether some part of me already knew, on a level below thought, that it would still be there. I didn't look. I'm still not sure if that was the right call or the only one I had. The coffee was still hot when I got back to the truck. That's the part I keep coming back to. Not the wet boot prints. Not the things she said. The coffee, sitting in the cup holder exactly where I'd left it, still hot, still steaming in the cold cab air, which meant I hadn't been inside the Nick Fuel and Go for more than 7, maybe 8 minutes. 7 minutes. That's how long it took for everything I thought I understood about a normal night run to come completely apart. Let me back up. It was a Tuesday in early November, one of those nights where the darkness has real weight to it, not just the absence of light but something that presses. I was running a partial load down from Fairbanks, nothing special. Scheduled drop in Anchorage by 6 a.m. I'd done that run probably 90 times, the kind of run where your hands know the wheel better than your brain does. I'd stopped at the Nick Fuel and Go just off the highway outside Talk. Small place. One pump island under a yellow light. A counter inside where a woman named whoever sold burnt coffee and pre-wrapped sandwiches and didn't ask you anything about your night. I liked it for that reason. I fueled up, went inside, bought a large coffee and a granola bar I didn't eat, exchanged maybe 12 words total, and walked back out to my truck. I climbed up, settled in, put the coffee in the cup holder. She was sitting in the passenger seat. I want to describe my reaction accurately because I think it matters. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't even a shout. It was this weird truncated sound I made in the back of my throat, like my body started to scream and then something overrode it before it could finish. Some circuit breaker tripping, and then about 2 full seconds of absolute stillness, where neither of us moved and I just looked at her. She was maybe mid-30s, dark hair, damp, not soaking but damp, like she'd been out in light precipitation. Wearing a canvas jacket, the kind with the flannel lining, dark green, jeans, no gloves, no hat. It was 19 degrees outside. She was sitting with her hands folded in her lap, looking straight ahead through the windshield, and she turned to look at me with an expression I can only describe as patient. Like she'd been waiting, and she wasn't bothered by the wait, and she'd expected me to come back eventually. I said something. I don't remember exactly what, some version of "who are you, what are you doing in my truck?" My voice came out wrong, too high. She said she needed a ride south. Said it simply, no desperation, no explanation, just a statement of fact the way you'd say you needed directions. I should have told her to get out, I know that. Looking back with the clarity you only get after the fact, the correct move was, get out of my truck, I'm calling someone, this isn't, whatever this is, it isn't happening. But here's the thing nobody tells you about genuinely frightening moments. They don't feel like horror movie moments while they're happening. They feel deeply, profoundly awkward. My brain wasn't screaming danger. My brain was cycling through social scripts and coming up empty. A woman in my locked truck. Okay, is she in trouble? Said somebody, how is she? I unlocked my truck with the key fob from outside. I always do. The locks engage automatically when I leave. I didn't say that to her then. I just asked where south. She said Delta Junction would be fine. That's about 100 miles down the Alaska highway. I told myself she was someone's wife, someone's daughter, stranded, scared, and the locked door was something I'd misremembered. I told myself that for about 4 miles. The boot prints showed up when I turned on the interior cab light to check my side mirror adjustment about 15 minutes outside Talk. They were on the floor mat on her side. Wet boot prints, the full outline, heel to toe. Multiple of them, overlapping, like she'd shifted her feet several times. And I want to be precise about why this landed wrong, because it sounds mundane written out. Wet boot prints from a person who'd been inside, so what? But it hadn't rained, it hadn't snowed. I'd been out at that fuel stop, walked across the same gravel lot she would have had to cross to get to my truck, and my own boots were completely dry. I'd noticed that specifically because I'd been thinking about whether the lot was icy. The gravel had been dry and cold and dusty. Her boots had left wet prints. I didn't say anything about it. I looked at them for probably 3 seconds, and then I looked back at the road, and I had a conversation with myself in my head that went, there's a reason for this. You don't know the reason. That's fine. Keep driving. Delta Junction. Done. She can get out at Delta Junction, and you will never think about this again. She spoke maybe 4 times in the next 40 minutes. Not much. Once to say it was getting colder, which it was, temperatures were dropping, nothing unusual. Once to mention that the bridge over the Talk River ran narrow, and I should watch my clearance on the right. Which was true. I knew that. I'd crossed it 100 times. But it was a strange thing to know if you were a stranded woman outside a truck stop in November. Once, around the Dot Lake stretch, she said something about a jackknife that had happened near there. She said it casually, like she was making conversation. There had been a jackknife on that stretch. I knew about it because it had backed up traffic for 6 hours one night about 4 years earlier. Old news, road gossip, maybe she'd heard it from someone. I told myself that. The 4th time she spoke, she turned and looked at me. And I mean really looked at me, not the idle glance of a passenger checking in. And she said, you should call your brother when you get to Anchorage. I have one brother. He lives in Wasilla. I hadn't spoken to him in about 7 months over some stupid argument I don't even fully remember the shape of anymore. She had no way of knowing I had a brother. She had no way of knowing I hadn't called him. I had never mentioned him. We had talked about almost nothing, I said. How do you know about my brother? She turned back to the windshield and didn't answer. I want to tell you there was some moment of confrontation. Some dramatic pulling over, demands for explanation, something. There wasn't. I drove. I drove because stopping on the Alaska highway at night felt worse than continuing. I drove because whatever was sitting in my passenger seat had not threatened me, and I had no framework for what to do with something that hadn't threatened me, but was nonetheless profoundly, fundamentally wrong. I stopped for fuel at the Delta Junction Petro just before 2 a.m. I pulled up to the pump, engine running, and I said, "We're here. Delta Junction, like you said." No answer. I looked over. The seat was empty. I sat there for, I don't know, a while. Engine running, fuel gauge on low, the pump island lights buzzing, that particular buzzing they do in the cold. Then I got out on automatic, ran my card, fueled up, got back in, and sat there some more. I looked at the passenger side floor mat. The boot prints were still there. Dried now, but still visible. The ghost of them in the mat fibers. Still there. She was gone and the print stayed. I don't know why that detail hit harder than anything else, but it did. It does. The prints stayed. I drove to Anchorage. I made my drop at 5:50 a.m. I sat in the cab in the delivery yard for a long time after. Then I called my brother. He picked up on the second ring, which surprised me because it was early. He sounded not upset, not like something was wrong, just awake. Quiet. He said he'd been thinking about me lately. Said he'd been meaning to call. Said he was glad I'd reached out. I said, yeah, me too. I never told him why I was calling at that hour. I never told him about the woman in the truck. I've never told anyone the full version until right now, and even now I'm leaving things out. Specific things I said to her, specific things she said back in those early miles, that I've convinced myself I misheard or misremembered, because the alternative is something I don't want to hold on to. Small things, things that knew too much. I had the floor mat professionally cleaned 2 days later. The guy at the detailing place said the staining was unusual. The moisture had gotten down into the mat backing in a way that didn't make sense for simple wet boots. He said it almost looked like the moisture had come from below the mat rather than above it. I didn't go back to the Nick Fuel and Go for almost 2 years after that. When I finally did stop there, different night, different run, needing fuel and not willing to run the extra 11 miles to the next station, I asked the woman at the counter about it. Casual. Whether they got many people looking for rides from the lot. Whether that was a common thing. She looked at me for a second. She said sometimes people left notes on the board by the door, asking for lifts south. She said they hadn't had anyone actually approach drivers directly in the lot in a long time. I asked how long. She thought about it. She said as far as she knew, not since a woman had gone missing from that stretch of highway a few years back. Said she'd been trying to get to Delta Junction. Said they'd found her car abandoned about a mile east, door open, engine still running. Said as far as she knew they'd never found her. I paid for my coffee. I walked out to my truck, checked the cab before I got in, looked at the passenger seat, looked at the floor mat, looked in the sleeper. Empty, just my gear, my logbook, the ordinary mess of a working truck. I got in, I drove south. I still check before I get in, every single time. I don't know what I'd do if it wasn't empty. I don't want to find out. Look, I'm going to tell this the way it actually happened, which means it's going to sound like I'm making it up. And I understand that, and I genuinely do not care anymore. 5 trucks left the Matanuska fuel depot outside Palmer at 11 p.m. on a Wednesday in late February. I know it was Wednesday because I remember thinking as we pulled out that my wife had asked me to be back by Friday for her sister's thing, and I was doing the math on whether the turnaround in Anchorage gave me enough cushion. That's the kind of thing your brain is doing when one of your convoy trucks disappears off the face of the earth. Grocery list math, wife's sister's thing math, not exactly the headspace you'd choose for what came next. 5 trucks. Me up front, then Depot 2 behind me, then a contracted rig we'd picked up for the run, a private hauler out of Wasilla who'd done the Glen maybe 40 times and knew the road, then Depot 4, then Depot 5 bringing up the rear. Standard staggered formation, about a quarter mile between each rig, CB on Channel 9 for convoy traffic. Load was industrial equipment heading into Anchorage. Nothing interesting, nothing dangerous. The kind of cargo that doesn't even get a second look at the weigh station. Weather was cold but manageable. -8 at the Palmer Depot. Maybe -12 by the time we'd be running the higher elevation sections through the Matanuska-Susitna stretch. Clear sky, low wind. The Glen was in good shape. I'd checked the DOT conditions board twice before departure, and both times it had come back clean. No ice advisories, no blowover warnings, no construction. A nothing special February run. We were 2 hours and about 40 miles in, somewhere in the corridor between Sheep Mountain Lodge and Eureka Summit, when Depot 4 came on the radio. He said, "Where'd the Wasilla guy go?" I want to explain what that question meant in context, because sitting at home reading it off a screen, it sounds almost boring. But you have to understand the geography of that stretch of the Glen. It runs through a valley between mountain ridges on both sides. The Chugach to the south, the Talkeetna starting to show themselves to the north. The road is 2 lanes, paved, reasonably maintained. There are pullouts, yes. There are the occasional side roads, a few mining access tracks, a lodge driveway or two. But it is not a road with exits. It is not a road where a truck can simply turn off and vanish into civilization. If you leave the Glen Highway in that corridor, you are going into wilderness or you are going into a ditch. Those are your 2 options. When Depot 4 said, "Where'd the Wasilla guy go?" he meant that the truck that had been running directly in front of him, maintaining a quarter-mile gap the way we'd set up, had simply stopped being there. No brake lights, no turn signal, no sound on the radio. Between one look and the next, the gap between Depot 4 and me, which should have had a truck in it, was just road. I came back on the CB and said, "Say again," because that's what you say when someone tells you something that cannot be true. Depot 4 said it again. Said 1 minute he'd had taillights ahead of him, the next he didn't. Said he'd assumed maybe the guy had hit a grade and fallen back further than usual, so he'd held his speed and waited for the gap to close. It didn't close, he slowed, he looked. Nothing behind him but Depot 5, running where he was supposed to be, a quarter-mile back. The slot where the Wasilla contractor had been running was empty. I slowed the whole convoy down and we did a radio count. Me, Depot 2, Depot 4, Depot 5, 4 voices, 4 trucks. We should have had 5. Nobody had heard anything. No road noise, no collision, no distress call. The CB had been quiet for the better part of an hour because there was nothing to report. The Wasilla driver, and I want to be careful here, I want to be accurate, had checked in at the Sheep Mountain Lodge Roadhouse just like the rest of us, about 40 minutes back. He'd made a joke about the coffee that I don't remember the specifics of, but remember being some variation on it tasting like hot regret. He was there, he was present, he had a voice and a bad joke and a cup of bad coffee. Then he had 40 miles of nothing wrong and then he was gone. We stopped, all 4 of us. I pulled over on the right shoulder and put my hazards on, and the other 3 stacked up behind me, and we all got out, which is not something you do lightly on a highway at night in -12. And we stood there in the dark on the Glen Highway with our breath coming out in clouds and looked at each other. Here's what we did, because I want to be thorough about this. We drove back. Not all 4 trucks. I left Depot 2 and 5 with the loads on the shoulder, hazards running, and took Depot 4 back with me in his rig. We drove south, back toward Sheep Mountain, slow, maybe 20 miles an hour, both of us watching the shoulders with his spotlight running, looking for skid marks, looking for a gap in the guardrail, looking for any sign that a fully loaded commercial truck had left the road. We found nothing, and I mean that specifically and completely. We drove back 11 miles, which took us past the last point where Depot 4 had a confirmed visual on the guy, and the shoulders were clean. No skid marks, no guardrail damage, no debris, no tracks going off into the snow on either side. The snow on both shoulders was unbroken and smooth, the way snow gets when nothing has touched it for hours. A loaded commercial truck weighs 80,000 pounds. When it leaves a road, it does not do so quietly. It does not pick itself up and set itself down gently in the trees without leaving a mark. It destroys everything it touches. There should have been something. A scrape, a furrow, a broken branch, a compression in the snow. There was nothing. We called it in. State troopers came out of Glen Allen, took about an hour. They walked both shoulders with lights. They called in a second unit. They found the same thing we found, which was nothing. I gave a statement that I've given versions of many times since. 5 trucks, 1 missing, no incident, no sound, no sign. The trooper writing it down had the expression of a man trying very hard to remain professionally neutral in the face of something he had no box to put it in. They found the truck 6 days later. I want to be careful about how I say this next part because I've been told different versions of secondhand, and I only know what I was told directly, which is this. The truck was found on a logging access road off the Glen, approximately 3 miles south of where Depot 4 lost visual on it. The road was not visible from the highway. It was an unmarked track through the trees, the kind that doesn't show on any DOT map, the kind that logging operations cut and then abandon and that slowly gets swallowed back by the landscape over years. The truck was parked, not crashed, parked engine off, load intact. The driver was not in it. They searched. Ground teams, the works, all through that area. As far as I know, and I followed this for a long time, called contacts, read everything I could find, they never found him. No body, no trace. His phone was in the cab, his logbook was open on the dash to the correct page. His coffee thermos, the one he'd filled at Sheep Mountain, was in the cup holder, still a third full. I have turned this over in my head for going on 5 years. I have built and demolished 100 explanations. The one I keep coming back to, the one that makes the most logistical sense if you set aside everything that makes no sense about it, is that he turned off voluntarily, that for some reason, in that stretch between Sheep Mountain and Eureka, he decided to take an unmarked logging track off the highway, park a fully loaded truck, and walk away from it. But that track was not visible from the road. I went back in daylight. I stood on the highway shoulder and looked for it. You couldn't see the entrance unless you knew exactly where to look. You wouldn't turn onto it by accident. You wouldn't turn onto it at night in the dark, going highway speed, unless you knew it was there. And he wasn't from that area. He was a Wasilla contractor. He'd run the Glen 40 times, he'd told us at the depot. Always the main highway, always straight through. He had no reason to know that track existed. I finished the run to Anchorage that night with 4 trucks, and a question I haven't been able to put down since. I didn't make it back for my wife's sister's thing, missed it by 2 days. She wasn't thrilled. I tried to explain and got about 3 sentences in before I realized there was no version of this story that landed correctly in a normal kitchen conversation. So I said there'd been a situation with the convoy and left it there. She said, "What kind of situation?" I said, "A truck went missing." She said, "Like the cargo?" I said, "Yeah, like the cargo." It was easier that way. I still run the Glen occasionally. Every time I pass that corridor between Sheep Mountain and Eureka Summit, I look at the shoulders. Not for anything specific, just look. The way you check a room when you walk in without knowing what you're checking for. Whatever I'm looking for, I haven't found it. I'm not sure I want to. The transmission came in at 11:43 p.m. and I wrote down the time because that is the kind of person I am. I have kept a road log since my 3rd year running the Richardson. Not an official one, not for the company, just a personal record in a spiral notebook I keep in the door pocket. Conditions, times, anything unusual, mileage checkpoints, weather transitions. It started as a habit for safety and became something else over the years. Something closer to compulsion, a way of making the road feel knowable by writing it down. My ex-wife called it my captain's log, and not in a complimentary way. I called it thorough. We were both right. So when the transmission came in, I wrote it down. 11:43 p.m., Channel 19. Richardson Highway, southbound, somewhere in the corridor between Paxson and Copper Center. A stretch of about 120 miles that is, without overstating it, one of the more isolated pieces of drivable road in North America. To the east, the Alaska Range. To the west, the Wrangell Mountains beginning to announce themselves on the horizon. The pipeline running roughly parallel to the road, visible occasionally through the trees. No towns. A few lodges, most of them closed for the season. In November, on a clear night, the kind of dark that makes you understand darkness as a physical substance, rather than just the absence of light. I'd been on the radio intermittently through the evening. Nothing unusual. Checking conditions, the standard back and forth you do on a long isolated run. Channel 19 was quiet by that point, had been for maybe 2 hours. Which is why the voice, when it came, hit the way it did. Not loud, not dramatic, just a voice in a quiet cab, and I reached over and turned up the squelch out of instinct. The voice was calm, male, older, not elderly but experienced, the particular flatness of someone who has been talking on CB radio for 20 years and has no performance left in him. He said he was southbound on the Richardson, running loaded, and he was describing conditions. Specifically, he mentioned a section of black ice forming on the road surface about 14 miles south of Paxson. Said it was new ice, thin, the kind that looks like wet pavement in headlights until you're already on it. He gave the mile marker. He mentioned that the temperature had dropped 3 degrees in the last 30 minutes, which he said he was tracking on his cab thermometer. He mentioned that the Gulkana River crossing was showing some wind sheer off the ice. Nothing dangerous yet, but worth taking the bridge at reduced speed. Specific. Precise. The kind of road information that saves lives on the Richardson in November. I copied it, said thanks for the heads up, and I slowed down approaching the mile marker he'd mentioned. The ice was exactly where he said it was. I felt it under the wheels, that particular absence of grip that you learn to recognize before your brain is finished processing it. I came through clean because I was already at reduced speed. I crossed the Gulkana Bridge at 25 miles per hour and felt the wind come off the river ice at exactly the angle he'd described. Everything he said was accurate. Every single detail. I came back on the channel and thanked him again. No response. I tried twice more over the next hour. Nothing. Which isn't unusual. Drivers sign off, change channels, lose range. I didn't think about it. I found out 14 months later. This is the part that requires some explaining. So bear with me because I want to get it right. About a year after that run, I was at the Copper Center Lodge doing what I sometimes do on layovers, going through my road log, which by that point had filled 3 notebooks. I don't know exactly what I was looking for. Sometimes I go back through old entries looking for patterns, weather conditions, road degradation, that kind of thing, practical stuff. I found the entry from that November night, wrote it out exactly as I'd recorded it. 11:43 p.m., Channel 19, southbound driver, black ice at the mile marker, Gulkana wind shear, all of it. I sat with that entry for a while. Something had been sitting in the back of my mind about it for months. Something I hadn't been able to name. The voice. The specific quality of the voice, the flatness, the precision, the complete absence of small talk or personality. Just information, delivered like reading from a checklist. I asked the woman running the lodge counter that evening, mostly as conversation, whether she knew the Richardson well. She'd been there for years, knew the road the way locals know roads, personally, intimately. I described the stretch near the Gulkana crossing, asked about conditions that time of year. We talked for a while. At some point, I mentioned I'd gotten good road information from another driver that night, somebody southbound who'd called out the ice. She asked when. I told her the date. She looked at me for a moment. Then she went to the back and came out with a 3-ring binder that she set on the counter. She said she kept a record of road incidents. Not official, just her own, for the same reason I kept my log. She flipped through it and found the page and turned it to face me without saying anything. There had been a fatality on the Richardson that night. A southbound driver, veteran, ran the Richardson for years out of a company based in Delta Junction. Single vehicle accident approximately 6 miles south of Paxson. He'd hit black ice. The report listed the time of the accident at 11:38 p.m. 11:38. I had received the transmission at 11:43. I want to walk through this the way I walked through it that night at the Copper Center Lodge counter, because I think the sequence matters. The accident happened at 11:38. My log shows the transmission at 11:43. 5 minutes after a man hit black ice and died on the Richardson Highway, a voice on Channel 19 warned me about black ice at that exact location, on that exact road, with the kind of detail that only comes from someone who has just driven through it. I said this to the woman behind the counter. Not dramatically. I don't do things dramatically. I just laid out the sequence and said it didn't fit together, and asked her if I was missing something. She didn't answer right away. She closed the binder and put it back under the counter. Then she said that she'd heard things about that stretch of the Richardson over the years. Said she'd had other drivers mention picking up transmissions on that road at night that they couldn't account for. She said it in the careful way people say things when they believe them completely, but have learned to be careful about who they say them to. I asked if she knew the driver, the one in the report. She said she did. Said he'd stopped at her lodge on runs for years. Said he was meticulous, kept records, knew the road in detail, was the kind of driver who called out hazards for other people as a matter of habit. Had been doing it for 20 years. I drove that stretch again in the spring. Daylight, clear conditions, nothing to find. I stopped at the mile marker from the report and got out and stood on the shoulder for a few minutes. I don't know what I expected from that. Nothing presented itself. The road was a road. The mountains were in the distance. The pipeline ran parallel through the trees. On the way back through in the evening around the Gulkana crossing, I turned the CB to Channel 19 and left it on squelch for the full stretch. 2 hours of road. A few routine check-ins from other drivers, nothing unusual. Near the Paxson end of that corridor, just as I was about to switch back to Channel 9, There was a brief burst of static. The kind that can be atmospheric, can be terrain, can be a dozen mundane things on a mountain road. And then nothing. I wrote it down anyway. Time, location, channel. That's what I do. I write things down because the road needs to feel knowable. Because if you record it precisely enough, pattern emerges. And pattern means explanation. And explanation means the road is something you understand, rather than something that happens to you. I have looked at that entry a lot of times since then. I haven't found the pattern yet. What I have found is this. I have been more careful on the Richardson in November than I have any technical reason to be, given that I know that road as well as I know anything. I take the Paxson corridor slower than conditions require. I cross the Gulkana Bridge at 25 even when there's no ice. My ex-wife, when I told her a stripped-down version of this once, said I was being superstitious. I said I didn't think that was the right word. She asked what the right word was. I thought about it for a while. I said I thought the right word was grateful. That whatever had come through on Channel 19 that November night had given me accurate information that I had used to keep my truck on the road. That regardless of what it was or wasn't, the information was real, and the ice was real, and the Gulkana wind was real, and I had come through clean. She said that was a strange way to look at it. I said most things worth looking at are strange if you look at them long enough. She didn't have an answer for that. Neither do I, really. But I wrote it down. I write everything down. It's all in the log. The food was good. That's the thing that unsettles me most when I think about it now. Not the silence, not the drive back in the morning, not what I found when I returned. The food was good. Whoever made it knew what they were doing. The coffee was real coffee, not the burnt bottom of the pot variety you get at every truck stop between Fairbanks and Anchorage. The biscuits were fresh. The gravy had weight to it, the kind that takes time. Somebody had stood over a stove and made that meal with care, and that detail has lodged in me like a splinter I can't reach. Because nothing else about that place made any sense at all, and the food makes the least sense of everything. It was a Tuesday in late September, Parks Highway, northbound, somewhere in the long empty corridor between Talkeetna and Cantwell. I was running solo. No convoy, no schedule pressure, just a straightforward equipment haul up to a construction staging area outside Healy. I'd done that run maybe 15 times over 2 seasons, and I knew the parks the way you know any road you've spent real time on. Not just the surface of it, but the feel of it, the rhythm. The places where it opens up and the places where it pinches down. The landmarks you stop consciously registering after a while, which is probably why I noticed the light. It was coming up on 10 p.m., and the parks in late September is dark in a way that needs qualification. Not just nighttime dark, but the specific dark of a road that has very few artificial lights along it for stretches of 30 and 40 miles. So when I saw the glow coming from the east side of the road, set back maybe 200 feet into the trees, it registered immediately. Not bright, not a floodlight, not a gas station, a warm, low amber kind of glow, the kind windows make when there's a lamp inside. I had not noticed any building there on previous runs, but I also hadn't been looking, and it was possible I'd passed it 100 times in daylight without clocking it properly. There was a gravel track leading off the highway. I almost missed it, caught it in my peripheral at the last second, and made the turn more out of curiosity than any real plan to stop. The track was rough but passable. I followed it through maybe 150 feet of black spruce and came out into a small cleared area. The building was low, long, wooden, the kind of roadhouse construction you see in old photographs of Alaska from 50 years back. A covered porch running the full front length. 2 windows with light coming through them. A hand-painted sign above the door that I couldn't read clearly in the dark from my cab. I could make out that it had words on it, but not what they said. There were no other vehicles in the clearing. No fuel pumps, no signage beyond that one board above the door. Nothing to indicate what the place was or who it served. I sat in the cab for probably 2 minutes trying to make a decision. I was not particularly hungry. I was not low on fuel. There was no practical reason to stop. But it was a 10-hour run. I was maybe 4 hours in, and there was something about the amber light in those windows that was, I want to choose this word carefully, inviting. Not supernaturally, not in a horror story way, just warm. The way a lit window looks when you're cold and outside and the night is pressing in. I went in. The interior was one long room, plank floor, wood walls, a low ceiling with exposed beams. 4 tables, plain wood, mismatched chairs. A counter along the back wall with a pass-through to what I assumed was a kitchen. A wood stove in the far corner putting out real heat. The kind of place that exists in a particular register of Alaskan memory, the roadhouse as a functional object, built for the road and nothing else. No ambition beyond keeping travelers fed and warm. There were 3 people at the tables, 2 at a table near the window, 1 alone near the stove. I didn't look at them closely when I walked in. You don't usually. You find a seat, you settle, you let your eyes adjust. I took a table near the counter and sat down. Nobody spoke. Not unusual, I told myself. Late hour, tired people, remote road. Nobody's obligated to make conversation. A woman came through from the kitchen. Older. I would have said 60s, maybe older, with the kind of face that outdoor Alaska produces over decades. She set a menu in front of me without speaking, without making eye contact, and went back through the pass-through. The menu was laminated, simple. 4 or 5 items, handwritten originally, and then photocopied so many times the text had that soft gray generation-lost quality. Biscuits and gravy, soup, a burger, coffee. I ordered the biscuits and gravy and coffee when she came back. She wrote it down on a small pad and went to the kitchen, and I sat there in the quiet room with the wood stove ticking and the amber light doing what amber light does. Here is what I remember about the other people in the room. The 2 at the window table were a man and a woman, middle-aged or older, wearing the kind of heavy canvas workwear that could belong to any decade. They had food in front of them. They were not eating when I came in. They were not eating while I was there. They were sitting in the posture of people who had just eaten or were about to, upright, present. But the food just sat on the table and they sat with it and did not touch it. The man near the stove had his hands wrapped around a coffee cup. He was looking at the stove. He did not look at me when I came in. He did not move, that I saw, in the entire time I was there. Not a shift in posture, not a hand moving to lift the cup. Just still. The way objects are still. None of them spoke. Not to me, not to each other. Not to the woman who brought my food. My food came quickly, faster than biscuits and gravy should come, if someone is making it fresh, which is what I thought at the time because it tasted fresh. That's the detail I keep returning to. Real butter, real gravy, biscuits that had come out of heat recently. The coffee was dark and strong and exactly right. I ate the whole thing, which I almost always don't do with roadhouse food, because roadhouse food is usually functional rather than good. This was good. I ate and I paid. Cash, exact change that the woman accepted without producing a receipt, and I walked out and drove back to the park's highway and continued north. I don't know exactly when the unease started. Somewhere around Cantwell, maybe an hour later, I began running back through the stop the way you replay things when something's bothering you, but you haven't identified what yet. The silence, the people who weren't eating, the food that shouldn't have been that fresh, the sign I couldn't read. I came back south on the parks 3 days later, same route, mid-afternoon, clear weather. I took the gravel track off the highway. There was no building. I want to be precise about this. The track was there. I recognized the turn, the angle of it, the way it fed through the black spruce. I followed it to the same clearing. I know it was the same clearing because the dimensions were right. The tree line on the far side was right. The ground was flat where I remembered flat. But there was no building. No foundation, no debris, no evidence of recent demolition. What was there? And this is the part I have gone back to in my mind more times than I can count, was the outline of a structure in the vegetation. Not ruins, not collapsed walls. Just a rectangle of ground where the plant growth was different. Lower, as if something had stood there for a long time, and the land was still in the process of forgetting it. I got out and walked the clearing. Found broken glass in the grass near where the window would have been. Found what might have been part of a porch post, weathered down to almost nothing. Found a piece of that laminated menu, faded and water-damaged and barely legible, caught against the base of a spruce tree. I stood in that clearing for a long time. The glass was old. The post was old. Whatever had stood in that clearing had not stood there recently. Had not stood there for years, maybe decades, by the look of the ground. And I had eaten biscuits and gravy in it 3 days ago. I have told this story twice in my life. Once to a driver I trusted who listened to the whole thing and then said he believed me, which I appreciated. And once to my youngest, who was 12 at the time and probably shouldn't have heard it, but was staying up late and asked me why I sometimes just stared out the kitchen window when I thought nobody was watching. I told her something had happened on the road once that I was still figuring out. She asked if it was scary. I thought about the amber light, the wood stove, the biscuits. The three people sitting in the posture of the present but somehow absent from it. The woman who took my order without looking at me, moving through that room like she'd been moving through it for longer than was possible. I told my daughter it wasn't scary exactly, that it was more like finding a door in a wall that shouldn't have a door, and walking through it, and finding a room that shouldn't exist, and eating a meal in it, and walking back out, and the door being gone. She thought about that. She said that sounded more sad than scary. I think she was right. It does feel sad, looking back, something preserved past its time, something still going through the motions of warmth and function and hospitality for travelers who, I don't know, for travelers who maybe stopped coming a long time ago. I still take the parks north regularly. I still know the turn. I have not taken the track again. The food was too good. That's the problem. If it had been bad, I could let it go. The prints were going the wrong way. That's what I figured out standing in the snow at 6 in the morning with frost on my beard and my headlamp throwing a pale circle on the ground and my truck 40 yards behind me still running because I hadn't wanted to shut it off in case I needed to leave fast. Wrong way. Not toward the shelter, which was where I needed to go, which was where I had just come from, away from it. Into the trees. Deeper into the kind of dark that doesn't respond to headlamps because the spruce are too dense and too close, and the light just dies against them. I had followed those prints for nearly a quarter mile. I need to sit with that for a second before I continue, because I think it's important to understand what a quarter mile means in that context. -31. Whiteout conditions dropping to near zero visibility every few minutes when the gusts came through. An engine that had been threatening to quit for the last 90 minutes, and me on foot in the dark following boot prints in the snow that I had believed, completely and without question, were leading me somewhere safe. They were not leading me somewhere safe. It started the way bad nights on the Elliott Highway always start, gradually, and then all at once. I'd left Fairbanks around 7 p.m., which in January means you leave in full dark because there is no other kind. The Elliott runs northwest out of Fairbanks toward Manly Hot Springs, about 150 miles of road that starts paved and transitions to gravel, and gets progressively less interested in your survival the further along it you go. I wasn't going all the way to Manly. I had a materials drop at a mine site access road around mile 90, one of those arrangements where you leave the load at a marked turnout and don't ask questions about who picks it up or when. Standard remote delivery. I'd done it 4 times before without incident. The weather had been questionable on departure and became genuinely bad around mile 40. Temperature dropped fast, faster than the forecast had suggested, which on the Elliott is a known hazard. The terrain funnels cold air in ways the weather models don't fully account for. By mile 55, I was in the middle of something that was technically a ground blizzard. Not snowfall exactly, but existing snow being driven horizontal by 35-knot gusts coming off the flats to the north. Visibility collapsing every few minutes to near nothing and then opening back up to maybe 100 feet, then collapsing again. The road surface had gone from packed snow to glare ice over packed snow, which is its own special category of terrible. My engine started giving me trouble around mile 60. Not catastrophic. A temperature warning light that I'd been watching flicker for 20 minutes before it committed to staying on. The heater was working, but the engine was working harder than it should have been. And I know that truck well enough to know the difference between a warning I can nurse through and a warning that is the last conversation I'm going to have before something expensive happens. I found a wide spot on the shoulder around mile 63 and pulled over to think. Let me tell you about the Elliott at mile 63 in January at roughly 9:30 at night. There is nothing there. I want to be completely accurate about this. There is road, and there are trees on both sides of the road, and there is whatever the weather is doing, and there is your truck, and there is you. The nearest structure I knew about was a DOT maintenance shed I'd passed around mile 51 12 miles back. The mine site was 27 miles ahead. My phone had one bar that disappeared when I tried to use it. My CB had range of maybe 2 miles in those conditions. I had cold weather gear, emergency supplies, the standard kit. I've been running remote Alaska roads for a long time, and I am not a person who treats the backcountry casually. But the engine warning was getting worse, and the temperature outside was -28. and dropping, and I was trying to do math about how long a cab stays warm after an engine dies and not enjoying the answers I was coming up with. I got out to check the engine, spent about 10 minutes with the hood up in the wind, which is 10 minutes I would not recommend to anyone, and determined that the issue was likely the coolant temperature sensor or an actual cooling problem, and that either way I was not driving 27 miles on it in these conditions without risking a full breakdown in a worse spot than where I currently was. So I was thinking about the DOT shed, 12 miles back. Too far to walk in this weather, I knew that clearly. But thinking about it anyway, the way you think about the only option you have, even when it's not a real option. That's when I saw the prints. They appeared in my headlamp beam on the shoulder ahead of the truck, boot prints, human-sized, coming from the direction of the tree line and tracking north along the shoulder parallel to the road. Fresh, sharp-edged, not wind-softened, which meant recent. In a ground blizzard that had been running for 90 minutes, sharp-edged prints meant very recent. Minutes, maybe. My first thought was another driver, somebody else stopped up ahead, which would mean warmth and radio range and two people solving a problem instead of one. My brain grabbed onto that explanation and held it. I followed the prints north along the shoulder, headlamp down, watching them. They were evenly spaced, a normal walking stride, not hurried. They tracked the shoulder for about 60 feet and then angled off to the right, into the trees, onto what appeared to be a narrow path or game trail heading east through the spruce. Something in me hesitated at the tree line. I stood there for a moment with the wind cutting through my layers and looked at the prints going into the dark and felt, and I'm going to be honest about this because I think it matters, nothing wrong. No alarm, no unease. I was cold and stranded, and there were fresh human prints leading somewhere, and my brain had decided, without consulting the rest of me, that somewhere was better than here. I went into the trees. The wind dropped inside the tree line, which was a relief, and the prints were easier to follow in the sheltered snow. I went maybe 100 feet, 200, keeping my headlamp on the prints, not looking up much, focused on not losing them where the trail bent. I was thinking about whoever was ahead of me, what I was going to say, whether they'd have a working radio or a warmer vehicle. At around the quarter-mile mark, I was estimating by time and stride, 3 or 4 minutes of walking, I stopped. I stopped because the trees had been getting denser, not less, because a path leading to a shelter or a vehicle would logically follow the road corridor or move toward the road, not away from it, because the ground had been trending downhill slightly, away from the highway elevation, into low ground where in spring there would be standing water, and in winter there was just depth and darkness. I stood there and I turned my headlamp back the way I'd come, and I looked at the prints I'd been following, and I saw what I should have seen at the tree line if I'd been thinking clearly instead of just cold and afraid. The prints were going one way. There was only one set, going in, mine going in alongside them. No prints coming out of the trees toward the road. Whatever had made these prints had not come from the road. It had not walked along the shoulder from a vehicle, stopped further north. It had come from somewhere in these trees and walked toward the road, and then I went back the next morning and checked. I need to get to that. And then what? I turned around. I walked back out to the highway. My truck was still running, temperature lights still on, and I got in and I sat there with the heat going, and I made a decision that I was staying with the truck regardless of what the engine did. Because outside that truck was the Elliott Highway in January and boot prints that came from the wrong direction. The engine held. The temperature light stayed on but didn't get worse. Around midnight the wind dropped and I was able to raise a trucker on the CB who was running north and stopped to look at the engine. Bad coolant hose, improvised fix with his kit, enough to get me to the mine site turnout and back. I got back to Fairbanks at 4 a.m., slept 4 hours, went back out to mile 63 in the daylight. I found the path. Followed the prints, mine and the other ones still visible in the sheltered snow under the trees, not yet wind disturbed. Followed them to the quarter-mile point where I'd turned back. Then I followed only the other set, the ones I hadn't made. They went another 60 yards deeper into the low ground, and then they stopped. Not at a tree, not at a structure, not at any landmark I could identify, they just stopped. Full stride, not the shortened steps of someone coming to a halt, not a turn or a change in direction. One full step and then nothing, unbroken snow in every direction around the last print. I stood there in the daylight looking at that last print for a long time. Then I walked back to my truck and drove to Fairbanks and ate a large breakfast at the first diner I came to, and did not talk to anyone about it for 3 years. I still run the Elliott. I still pass mile 63 a few times a season. I keep my eyes on the shoulder when I do. Not looking for the prints. I'm not interested in finding them again. I'm looking to make sure there's nothing walking alongside the road that shouldn't be there. So far, nothing. So far. The shape on the shoulder was low to the ground and not moving, and my first thought was dog. Not wolf, not bear, not anything dramatic, just dog. An injured dog, maybe hit by an earlier vehicle, lying on the gravel shoulder of the Seward Highway at the kind of hour when strays sometimes wander down from the hillside properties outside Girdwood. It was that mundane in the first second, that ordinary. My brain handed me the most boring explanation available, and I accepted it without question. The way you do when you're 4 hours into a night run and your threat assessment is running on reduced power. I was southbound, somewhere in the 20-mile corridor between Girdwood and Portage, a stretch of the Seward that runs between Turnagain Arm on the right and the Chugach Mountain faces on the left, steep and close. The kind of terrain that makes the road feel like a slot rather than a highway. Late October around 1 a.m. The arm was frozen along the edges but not fully across, and in the moonlight it put off a gray-silver reflection that lit the right side of the road in a way that was almost helpful. Almost. The shape was on the left shoulder, tight against the base of the mountain face, dark-colored. Low, I estimated at the time, maybe 2.5 to 3 feet off the ground, motionless. Maybe 20 feet of shoulder between it and the rock face, and then the rock face going straight up. I slowed. Not dramatically. I came down from 50 to about 25, enough to get a better look without committing to a stop. My headlights were full on it by that point, and I was trying to resolve the shape into something specific. The fur was wrong for a dog, too dark, too uniform, no variation. The proportions were wrong too, now that I was closer. Too wide across the middle relative to the length, and the head, if it was a head, was positioned in a way that didn't track with any animal posture I recognized. I pulled over. Here is the decision I have reconstructed and re-examined approximately 10,000 times since that night. I pulled over on the Seward Highway at 1 a.m. to check on what I thought was an injured animal. That is not an unreasonable thing to do. I have a good emergency kit. I've helped with roadside animal situations before, and leaving a large injured animal on the shoulder of an active highway is genuinely dangerous for the next driver who comes through. So the decision itself was sound. What I cannot account for, and this is the part that keeps the whole thing from being a strange animal story I tell at fuel stops, is what happened in the 30 seconds between when I stopped and when the thing stood up. I got out of the cab, left the engine running, left the headlights on, walked around the front of the truck and across the left lane to the shoulder. I was maybe 15 feet away when I stopped walking. Up close, the shape was larger than it had looked from the road. Not dramatically, not monster movie large, but larger than a dog by enough that I registered the discrepancy and felt the first edge of something that wasn't quite alarm yet. More like recalibration. My brain running a quick comparison between what it had predicted and what it was receiving. I stood there for what felt like a long time but was probably 5 seconds. Then it stood up. Not the way a dog stands, not the gathering of limbs, the familiar sequence of a 4-legged animal rising. It unfolded. That's the word I keep coming back to. It unfolded from the low crouch it had been in, and it did it in a single motion. And when it was done, it was standing, and it was not low to the ground anymore. It was somewhere between 4 and 5 feet at what I would have called the shoulder. Not the top of the head, which was unclear, which I couldn't resolve into a definite shape, but the highest clear point of the body before the head became ambiguous. It was facing away from me when it stood, facing the rock face, and then it turned. I am not going to describe what I saw when it turned because I genuinely cannot. Not because I'm being dramatic about it, but because my memory of that specific moment has a quality I can only describe as smeared. Like the image got motion blurred in the processing, and what I retained is impression rather than detail. Dark, wide-set eyes, or what registered as eyes, or what I interpreted as eyes because that's where eyes would be. A quality of attention that felt deliberate. Not the blank reactive attention of a startled animal. Something that had been aware of me before I was aware of it. It did not move toward me. It did not make a sound. It looked at me, or did the thing that functioned as looking, and I looked at it, and the turn-again arm put its gray light across the highway behind me, and the Chugach pressed down from the left, and there was about 12 feet of Alaskan night between me and whatever this was. I backed up, 3 steps, slow, the way you back away from things you do not want to startle. Then I turned and I walked to the truck. Not running. I was very deliberate about not running. I don't know why that felt important, but it did. And I got in and I pulled out onto the Seward and I drove south. I checked the mirror once at about 100 yards. The shoulder was empty. I don't know when it moved or where it went. I was watching the road. I told myself versions of the standard explanations for the next 2 weeks. Bear, which doesn't account for the standing or the proportions. Moose, which doesn't account for anything about it. Trick of light, which doesn't account for the 12-foot stare that lasted the better part of 10 seconds. I ran through the list and found the edges of each explanation and set them all aside. 3 weeks after that night, I was at the Tesoro in Soldotna, fueling up, and got talking to a driver I'd seen around but didn't know well. He ran the Seward regularly, Anchorage down to Homer and back. We were talking the way drivers talk. Road conditions, load timing, the usual, and he said something about the Girdwood corridor that made me stop. He said he'd seen something on the shoulder down there a few weeks back. He said it the way you say something when you've been waiting for the right ear. Carefully, not looking at me directly. Watching my face from the side for the reaction that would tell him whether to continue. I said go on. He described what he'd seen. Low to the ground, wrong proportions, wrong color for any animal he knew. He'd slowed but not stopped. He'd taken a photo through the windshield with his phone. Bad angle, bad light, moving vehicle, and he showed it to me. The image was blurry in the way of all the photographs that matter. A dark shape against the mountain's shoulder, caught in the outer edge of headlights. Indistinct. The kind of image that means nothing to someone who hasn't seen the thing itself, and means everything to someone who has. I knew the shape. I asked him what mile marker. He checked something on his phone. Said it was just south of Girdwood, left shoulder, tight against the rock face. Same shoulder, same position, same road. My mile marker and his were within 2 miles of each other. I asked when. He told me, 4 days after my encounter. I nodded. I said I'd seen something similar, which was the most I was willing to give in a parking lot under fluorescent lights to someone I didn't know well. He looked at me for a second, and then he looked back at the fuel pump and said, yeah, he figured. We finished fueling. He got back in his truck, I got back in mine. He died 6 weeks later. Single vehicle accident, Seward Highway southbound, the Girdwood corridor. Black ice listed as the cause. No other vehicles involved. The report said he'd gone off the left shoulder into the rock face. Left shoulder, same side. I found out through the driver network, the way you find out about things in this community. Somebody mentions it at a fuel stop. The information moves. When I heard the location, I felt something that I don't have a clean word for. Not guilt, exactly. Not surprise, exactly. Something that sits between those two things and has no name. I have thought about what it means that he saw it, and I did not. Whether seeing it and not stopping is the variable that matters. Whether the photograph made some kind of difference, the act of recording it, trying to capture it, showing it to another person. I have no framework for any of this, and I'm aware that I'm pattern matching onto tragedy in a way that may say more about how humans process guilt than about any actual causation. But I don't stop on the Seward anymore. Not in the Girdwood corridor, not on the left shoulder, not at night. I carry a dash cam now. I never look at the footage from that stretch. If something's on the shoulder, I don't want to see it twice. Once was enough to last me whatever time I have left. I think once is all it gives you anyway. I think that might be the whole point. The first sound came at mile 140 and I logged it as wind. That is what I told myself at the time, and that is what I wrote in my head in the moment. Wind, road vibration, the ordinary chorus of a loaded truck on a rough surface at night. The Dalton does things to sound. The road surface changes constantly, packed gravel to hardpan to frost-heaved asphalt and back, and each surface has its own acoustic signature, its own set of rattles and resonances that a new driver finds alarming and an experienced driver learns to read like a language. I had been running the Dalton for 4 years by that point. I knew its sounds the way I knew my own breathing. What I heard at mile 140 was not in the language I knew. It was a shift in the weight distribution of sound inside the cab. Not a new sound exactly, more like the acoustic character of the space behind me changed. The sleeper berth is separated from the cab by a curtain, thin insulated fabric, nothing substantial. When the berth is empty, sound moves through it a certain way, flat, unimpeded. The cab noise bounces off the back wall and comes back at you clean. What I heard at mile 140 was a very slight dampening of that return, the kind of change a body makes in a closed space. Absorption. I turned the radio down. The road went quiet except for the engine and the gravel and the wind outside. I told myself it was cargo shift. I was running a partial load, equipment parts in the box behind the fifth wheel, not in the sleeper, properly secured. But cargo shifts, it settles, it moves against straps. I told myself that. I kept driving. Mile 163 is where I stopped dismissing it. By that point, I had logged 3 more incidents in my head. A creak from behind the curtain that had the specific quality of weight shifting on a surface. A sound that may have been breathing or may have been the ventilation system doing something it sometimes does in the cold. And a moment somewhere around mile 155 where the temperature in the cab dropped by what felt like 3 or 4 degrees over the span of about 90 seconds. Not the heating failing, the dial hadn't moved. The output was the same. More like something cold had exhaled into the space. At mile 163 I heard clearly and without ambiguity the curtain move. Not billow, not a draft moving fabric. The specific sound of fabric being displaced by something pressing against it from the other side. A slow displacement, deliberate, like something leaning into it without pushing through. I want to tell you I pulled over immediately. I want to tell you I was decisive and calm and handled it the way a rational person handles a situation. What actually happened is that I gripped the wheel harder and increased my speed from 45 to 55 and stared at the road ahead with the focused intensity of a man who has decided that the road directly in front of him is the only thing that exists in the world. My heart was doing something I didn't like. I drove for another 6 miles without looking at the curtain. Here is what the logical part of my brain was doing during those 6 miles, because I think it's worth documenting. It was building explanations. Carbon monoxide causes auditory hallucinations. I checked the detector clip to the dash and it read clean. Sleep deprivation causes sensory distortion. I had slept 6 hours before departure, not ideal but not dangerous. The Dalton at night creates a particular psychological pressure, the isolation in the dark and the knowledge of how far you are from anything. And that pressure can make the mind manufacture presences. I have read about this. Explorers in extreme isolation report it. Single-handed sailors, polar expeditioners. The brain, deprived of social input, sometimes generates a companion out of nothing. I built all of these explanations carefully and thoroughly, and then I heard, at mile 169, a sound that demolished all of them. It was small. That's the thing. It wasn't a crash or a voice or something undeniable. It was a small sound, a soft rhythmic sound from directly behind the curtain, low and slow, roughly once every 4 or 5 seconds. Regular, patient, breathing, not ventilation, not road noise finding a new frequency. Breathing, the specific cadence of a living thing at rest, pulling air in and releasing it, the pause between cycles that only biology makes. I pulled over. The shoulder of the Dalton at mile 169 is wide enough for a truck, and that's about all that can be said for it. To the left, the Brooks Range foothills running dark against a sky that had some moonlight in it. To the right, a drop into a creek drainage, maybe 30 feet, not survivable. I put the hazards on. I sat there with the engine running for what I think was about 4 minutes, though it felt considerably longer, and I looked at the curtain. It was still. The breathing sound had stopped when I'd braked, or I'd stopped hearing it. I'm not sure those are the same thing. I am not a person who is easily frightened. I want to be clear about that, not as bravado, but as relevant context. I grew up in a part of Alaska where you learned early that fear is expensive and panic is a luxury the wilderness doesn't extend credit on. I have been in situations on the road that were objectively more dangerous than sitting in a parked truck on a wide shoulder with my hazards running. I have handled those situations by identifying the problem and addressing it. The problem was behind the curtain. I addressed it. I reached back and I pulled the curtain open in one motion, fast, no hesitation, because hesitation in that kind of moment costs you more than it saves. And I looked into the sleeper berth. Empty, my sleeping bag rolled up at the foot, my duffel on the left side. A paperback I'd been working through for 2 weeks, face down on the small shelf above the mattress. The ordinary archaeology of a working truck's sleeping space. Nobody there. I held the curtain open and looked at every inch of that berth. And there was nothing in it that hadn't been there. when I'd left Fairbanks 12 hours earlier. I leaned in, checked the corners, checked under the bag, checked the storage net above the mattress. Nothing. I sat back in the driver's seat, and I pulled the curtain closed and I put the truck in gear and I drove. I did not hear the breathing again. The temperature stayed normal. The curtain stayed still. For the next 60 miles, all the way to Coldfoot, the truck was a truck, mechanical, ordinary, indifferent. I rolled into the Coldfoot camp truck area at 2:40 a.m. and parked in the row with the other rigs and turned the engine off and sat in the silence. Then I reached back and pulled the curtain open again. The berth was the same as it had been at mile 169. Same bag, same duffel, same paperback. Except the sleeping bag had been at the foot of the mattress when I'd left Fairbanks. Rolled up, cinched, pushed to the far end the way I always leave it on departure. It was unrolled, laid out flat on the mattress, fully extended, the way it looks when someone has been sleeping under it. The pillow, which I had put in the storage net above the mattress because I don't use a pillow on short layovers, was on the mattress. At the head of the bag, indented. I got out of the truck. I stood in the Coldfoot lot in the cold and the dark for a long time. When I went back in, I checked every inch of that berth again. Checked the exterior of the truck. The box, the undercarriage, the exterior storage. Walked the lot. Knocked on the cab of the rig parked next to mine and asked the driver, who was awake and unhappy about the knock, whether he'd seen anyone near my truck. He said no. He said it in the tone of someone who wanted me to leave, so I left. I didn't sleep in the berth that night. I reclined the driver's seat as far as it went, and I slept there instead, cab door locked, curtain tied back so I could see the berth at all times. In the morning, I found the handprint. I don't know how I missed it the night before, except that I'd been looking at the bag and the pillow and hadn't looked at the walls. It was on the interior cab wall at the head of the berth. The forward wall, the one that separates the sleeper from the cab space, right at the level where a person lying down would have their head. A handprint pressed flat, the full palm and all 5 fingers, small. Child-sized or close to it, significantly smaller than my hand, and I don't have large hands. Made in something dark, oil or grease, the kind of substance that gets on hands in a working environment. I pressed my palm next to it for scale. My hand was nearly 30% larger. I was 180 miles from Fairbanks. I had made no stops between departure and mile 163 except for a fuel check at the Yukon River camp, which I had not left the cab for. The berth had been empty when I'd left. The doors lock automatically when I leave the cab. The print was warm. Not warm from the heater warm. Warm the way skin is warm. I pressed 2 fingers against it and held them there, and the warmth was there, present, specific. The warmth of something that had been pressed against that wall recently enough that the temperature hadn't equalized yet. I have driven the Dalton hundreds of times since that night. I have slept in that berth hundreds of times since that night. I replaced the wall panel, sanded it, primed it, painted over the print, which I should have photographed and didn't because I wasn't thinking clearly and wanted it gone. But I know what was under the paint, and some nights, running north in the dark, I hear the acoustic character of the space behind me change, and I turn the radio down and I listen, and then I make a decision about whether I want to know or whether I want to keep driving. Most nights I keep driving. The road is long and the dark is complete, and some questions, once you've looked away from them, need to stay looked away from. Some doors need to stay closed. The taillights appeared at mile 34, and I was grateful for them. That's the honest starting point. Not suspicion, not unease, gratitude. Pure, uncomplicated relief at seeing a pair of red lights in the dark ahead of me, because I had been alone on the Taka for going on 2 hours, and the storm had been building for the last 40 minutes into something that was reclassifying itself from bad weather into a genuine whiteout event. And another truck ahead meant a track to follow, meant someone else reading the road surface, meant the particular comfort of not being the only human being moving through a dark that was becoming difficult to distinguish like from standing still. I was westbound on Alaska Route 1, the Tok cutoff, running a scheduled delivery from Tok to Gakona Junction, about 125 miles of road that cuts through the Wrangell Mountains foothills, 2 lanes, no shoulder to speak of in winter when the snowpack builds out from the edges, the kind of road that demands your full attention in good conditions and your complete surrender in bad ones. It had been good conditions when I'd left Tok at 8 p.m. By 9:40 it was something else entirely. The storm had come in from the northwest faster than the forecast had suggested. the way Wrangell weather sometimes does. The mountains create their own systems, their own logic, and the weather models built for flat terrain don't always translate. Temperature had dropped from -6 to -19 in under an hour. Wind was coming in sustained at around 30 knots with gusts that periodically killed my visibility to 0 for 3 and 4 second intervals. The road surface had gone from packed snow to wind-scoured ice, the kind that offers the same friction as polished marble. I was at 30 miles an hour and it felt fast. And then the taillights. They were maybe a quarter mile ahead. 2 red ovals, clean and steady, not swinging or fishtailing, tracking straight down the center of the road with the kind of confidence that told me whoever was driving had either been on this road in conditions like this before or had no idea what they were doing and was getting lucky. I settled in behind them at the quarter-mile gap and immediately felt the specific anxiety of the last 2 hours ease by about 30%. A quarter mile is too far to read a plate or identify a make, especially in a storm. What I could see was the shape of the light. The spacing and height of the taillights suggested a truck, not a passenger vehicle. Sit higher than a car, wider spread. A working rig, probably loaded, which would explain the steady tracking. Loaded trucks behave better on ice than empty ones. I got on the CB. Channel 9, the standard highway channel for that road. I said I was westbound on the cutoff, mile 34, following another westbound truck, asked if they were on channel. No response. I tried twice more over the next 10 minutes. Nothing. Which I filed as, maybe they were on a different channel, maybe they had CB issues, maybe they just didn't feel like talking. All reasonable. I followed the lights. For the first 20 miles, it was exactly what it appeared to be. A truck ahead of me, moving at a consistent 28 to 32 miles an hour, holding its lane through the gusts, giving me a track to follow through the worst of the visibility drops. When my world collapsed to nothing for those 3 and 4 second intervals, I held my line and my speed, and trusted that the lights would be there when the world came back. They always were. There's a particular intimacy to following another vehicle through a whiteout that I don't think you can understand unless you've done it. The lights become everything. Your entire navigational universe reduces to 2 red ovals in the dark. You stop thinking about the road in any abstract sense, where it curves, what's alongside it, how far you are from anywhere. You think about the lights, you maintain the gap, you breathe. I was breathing. Around mile 54, I noticed the first thing that should have registered as wrong but didn't, because I had no framework for it yet. The lights didn't move. I mean, they moved obviously forward down the road, but they didn't vary. In a storm like that, on a road like the cutoff, even an experienced driver in a loaded truck will drift slightly, correct, drift again. The lights ahead of you will wander a few feet left, come back, wander right, come back. It's the natural oscillation of a human being making continuous small corrections. It's biological. It's what steering looks like from behind. These lights tracked dead center, mile after mile. Through gusts that moved my own truck 3 and 4 feet across the lane, the lights ahead didn't waver. Perfect line. Perfect speed. The road curved gently left around mile 58. I know that curve, a long sweeping bend that runs between 2 ridge shoulders, and the lights took it like they were on rails. Not overcorrecting, not the slight wide then tight arc of a truck navigating a curve in poor visibility. Rails. I noticed it and I filed it and I kept following. Mile 71 is where the storm peaked. I know because I was watching the weather instruments and the wind hit 47 knots sustained for about 6 minutes around mile 71, which is the kind of wind that makes a loaded truck feel like a sail and makes the road surface irrelevant because you're not really driving anymore, you're negotiating. I was down to 20 miles an hour, both hands, full attention, riding the gusts and recovering. The lights ahead didn't slow down. I lost ground on them, my 20 against their continued 30, and watched the gap open from a quarter mile to nearly half. I thought about trying to match their speed and decided against it, because 30 miles an hour in a 47-knot gust on glare ice is a choice I wasn't willing to make regardless of what the truck ahead was doing. The gap opened. The lights got smaller. I kept them in sight. The wind dropped around mile 78 and I came back up to speed and closed the gap back to the quarter mile, and the lights were there, steady, waiting. And that word arrived in my mind with a small hook in it that I didn't fully register until later. Waiting. I thought the word waiting and moved past it. I followed the lights for another hour. Mile 78 to approximately mile 112. The storm gradually lost its worst character. Still bad, still dangerous, but manageable rather than terminal. My shoulders, which had been somewhere around my ears for the past 90 minutes, began to descend toward their natural position. Gakona Junction was maybe 13 miles ahead. I was going to make the delivery. I was going to be fine. At mile 112, the road crests a long rise, maybe 2 miles of gradual climb, and then drops into a straightaway that runs down toward the Copper River drainage, flat and long, visible for a good distance on a clear night. I'd crested that rise dozens of times. I knew what was on the other side. I crested the rise. The lights were gone. Not pulled over, not turned off a side road. Gone, between 1 second and the next, as if they had simply stopped existing. I was at the crest, the road opening up ahead of me into the long, flat straightaway, and the straightaway was empty, dark. No tail lights, no headlights of a truck that had already descended and turned, no glow anywhere on the road ahead for as far as I could see, which in the clearing conditions was a substantial distance. I stopped. I sat at the crest of that rise with my hazards running and looked at an empty road for a long time. Then I looked at what was directly below me on the other side of the rise and felt the air go out of me in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. The road was gone, not metaphorically, not obscured by snow. The roadbed on the downhill side of that rise had collapsed. A section of maybe 60 to 80 feet. The asphalt and the gravel base and the material below it had given way into the drainage cut alongside the road, leaving a gap that dropped 8 or 10 feet to the creek bed below. No barrier. No warning signs. There hadn't been time, or the collapse was recent enough that nobody had reached it yet. Just the road ending and then a drop into the dark. I sat there for a very long time. I thought about the gap I'd allowed to open at mile 71. I thought about what would have happened if I'd pushed to maintain speed and closed that gap to 50 yards instead of half a mile. I thought about cresting that rise at 30 miles an hour behind a truck that I was trusting to be reading the road ahead. I called it in on the CB and got a DO2 crew response out of Glen Allen about 40 minutes later. While I waited, I walked the crest with my flashlight and looked at the road's surface on the approach side. The side I'd come up. Clean tracks in the packed snow, my tracks coming up the rise, one set. I walked back down the rise about 200 yards, to where the road was flat enough that 2 vehicles traveling the same direction would have left parallel tracks or overlapping tracks in the snow. The snow on that section was wind-packed and smooth, not ideal for reading, but not impossible. One set of tracks. Mine. The DOT crew, when they arrived, asked if I'd been following another vehicle. I said I thought I had. The lead guy looked at the road surface with his light for a while and didn't say anything about what he found or didn't find, and I didn't push it. On the drive back to talk, I tried to find the place where the lights had first appeared at mile 34. I found the location by mileage and pulled over and got out and looked at the road surface in my headlights. One set of tracks, westbound. I have no explanation for what I followed for 78 miles through a storm on the Talk Cutoff. I have no explanation for what it was or where it came from or what led me at the exact speed I needed to travel and held the exact line I needed to follow and then disappeared at the exact moment I needed to stop. I have no explanation and I have stopped looking for one. What I have instead is this: I am here. I made the delivery the next morning after the DOT cleared an alternate route. I drove home. I ate dinner. Whatever was ahead of me on the Talk Cutoff that night, whatever those lights were, they knew that road better than anything alive has a right to. And when the road ended, they were already gone. She was standing at the edge of the tree line, maybe 30 feet off the road, and the cold that night was the kind that makes your eyes water the second you step outside. That's the first time I saw her. 3rd week of January, Valdez Run, southbound on the Richardson, coming down through the Keystone Canyon stretch, where the road narrows and the rock walls come in close on both sides, and the river runs alongside, making that low, constant sound under the ice. I'd done this run every 10 to 12 days for going on 2 years. Same road, same canyon, same darkness in January. Because in Valdez in January, the darkness is not a time of day, it's a condition of existence. The sun doesn't clear the mountains. You run in dark, you deliver in dark, you drive back in dark. You stop seeing it after a while. I saw her because my headlights caught the reflective strip on her jacket. Small. That was my first clear impression. Child size, not a small adult, not an ambiguous figure at distance. A child, maybe 8 or 9 years old by the proportions, standing at the tree line in what looked like a light jacket and dark pants, no hat I could see, no gloves. 30 feet off the shoulder in snow that would have been knee-deep on a child that size. Standing still, facing the road, facing me. I slowed, not stopped, slowed, and looked and told myself it was a trick of the light because the alternative, a child standing alone in the Keystone Canyon tree line at 11 p.m. in January at -17, was not something my brain was willing to process as real. I told myself reflective strips on tree branches, ice formation, the way headlights do strange things in canyon terrain. I told myself these things with some conviction, and I drove on and I delivered my load to the Valdez terminal. And I drove back north, and I did not tell anyone what I'd seen because I had mostly convinced myself I hadn't seen it. 12 days later, I was southbound on the Richardson again. Same run, same timing, same stretch of canyon road. She was in the same spot, same position, 30 feet off the shoulder, tree line, facing the road. Same jacket, or what looked like the same jacket, the reflective strip catching my lights the same way. I was going slower this time, some part of me having apparently decided to be ready without consulting the rest of me. And I had a longer look. She was looking directly at the truck. Not at the road, not at the lights, at the truck, tracking it. The way you track something you are watching rather than something you happen to be facing. And her face, I'm going to be careful here because I was moving, and it was dark, and 30 feet is 30 feet. Her face was wrong in a way I couldn't immediately specify. Not disfigured, not monstrous, just wrong. The proportions slightly off in a way that nagged at me for the next 100 miles, without resolving into anything I could name. I called it in to the troopers from the terminal in Valdez. Gave the location, gave the description, said I'd seen a child in the Keystone Canyon corridor twice now. Same spot, late at night, no adult visible. The trooper I spoke to took the information with the professional patience of someone who has learned not to react until they've confirmed, and said they'd check it out. I asked him to call me with whatever they found. He said he would. He never called. The third time was 11 days after that, and I'd started counting the days between runs, which is something I'd never done before. And I was aware that I'd started doing it, and I didn't examine that awareness too closely. She was there. I stopped this time. I don't know when I made that decision. I don't remember deciding. I just remember braking, the truck slowing, pulling onto the narrow shoulder, hazards on. The canyon walls close on both sides, the river sound under the ice, the cold coming in around the door, seals the way it does when you've been running the heater for hours and then you stop. I put my window down. She was 30 feet away in the snow, and she was looking at me and the cold hit my face. And I looked back at her and I said, I'm aware of how this sounds. I said, are you okay? She didn't answer. She didn't move. I said, I'm going to call someone. I said, stay there. I picked up my phone and I had the number half dialed and I looked up. The tree line was empty. The snow between the trees was undisturbed, not the aftermath of something moving through it, not tracks or compressed surface. Undisturbed the way snow is when nothing has touched it. I got out of the truck. I know. I've thought about whether that was the right decision 10,000 times since that night, and I still don't have a clean answer. I got out because a child had been standing in that snow and was now gone, and the snow was undisturbed, and those two facts couldn't coexist, and I needed to resolve them in person. I walked to the tree line, 30 feet through knee-deep snow off the shoulder, which takes longer than it sounds, and I reached the spot where she'd been standing, and I looked down. No prints. I want to be precise about this the way I've been precise with myself about it for going on a year now. The snow at that tree line was undisturbed. Not tracks leading away that I'd missed. Not prints filled in by wind. There was no wind in the canyon that night. The walls block it. Undisturbed snow. The smooth crust of snow that has not been compressed by weight, and I was standing in the middle of it in prints I'd made myself, and there was nothing else. I stood there for a while. The river made its sound under the ice. The canyon walls were dark above me, and the rock faces had frost on them that caught the hazard light from my truck in orange pulses. I was alone in the Keystone Canyon at 11 at night in January in -17, and I was standing in undisturbed snow where a child had just been. I walked back to the truck. I sat for a long time before I drove. I need to tell you something about the Richardson through Keystone Canyon that I knew before any of this started, and that has sat differently in me since. There was an accident on that stretch, not recent, years back before my time on this run. A family, winter conditions, the road being what the road is in that corridor in January. I heard about it the way you hear about road history, secondhand, at fuel stops, the way bad stretches accumulate their stories over time. A car went into the river drainage. Adults survived. A child didn't. The details vary depending on who's telling it. Age, specifics. I've heard different versions. What stays consistent across every version is the location. Keystone Canyon, South End, right shoulder coming down from the north. I haven't been able to verify this. I looked and couldn't find a news record that matched clearly, which either means it was too long ago for easy searching, or means the story got distorted in the retelling the way road stories do. I genuinely don't know which. What I know is the spot. What I know is the child-sized figure in the tree line for 3 consecutive runs. What I know is the undisturbed snow. The 4th run, I came through that stretch in the daytime. Not on purpose. The delivery timing had shifted, morning load instead of evening. I drove through Keystone Canyon at 10 a.m. in weak winter daylight, the sun just barely clearing the canyon walls on the south face, the river ice gray and still. I looked at the tree line as I passed, empty. Just spruce and snow and the ordinary daylight emptiness of a canyon in winter. I don't know why that was worse. There was something about the daylight normality of that spot. Just trees, just snow, nothing remarkable about it in any way. That made the nighttime version feel less like something I'd seen and more like something the canyon had shown me specifically. Something that existed in the dark of that place the way cold exists in it. Not visiting. Resident. I requested a schedule change 2 weeks after that. Different run, different road. My supervisor asked why, and I said I wanted a change of pace, which is the kind of reason that requires no follow-up. He reassigned me without discussion. I haven't run the Valdez route since. That's been 11 months now. I think about her in the way you think about something you can't file anywhere. Not in the drawer labeled explained, not in the drawer labeled imagination, not in the drawer labeled grief, though that last one comes closest. There was something in the way she stood that felt less like haunting, the way horror movies mean it, and more like waiting. The patient, terrible waiting of something that has been in one place for a very long time and has learned that waiting is the only thing left to do. I stopped. On that 3rd run. I stopped and I rolled down the window and I spoke to her and she was gone before the sentence was finished. I've asked myself what would have happened if she'd answered. I've asked myself what I would have done if, instead of disappearing, she'd walked toward the truck through that knee-deep snow. I don't have an answer. I think the not knowing is the thing I'm going to carry. Not the fear. The fear faded after the first few months. What stayed is the weight of a child standing alone in the dark and the cold and the question I can't answer, which is whether stopping was the right thing or whether it made any difference at all, and whether somewhere in that canyon in the dark there is still a small figure at the tree line, 30 feet off the shoulder, facing the road, waiting for the next set of headlights to slow down. I hope it's not still waiting. I think it probably is. That's 10 stories. 10 runs, 10 roads, 10 things I can't explain and have stopped trying to. If you drive Alaska, if you run these roads at night in the dark and the cold, and the isolation that this state does better than anywhere on Earth, you know that the wilderness up here doesn't observe the same rules as the rest of the world. You know that the dark here is a different quality of dark. You know that the distance between you and the nearest human being, out on the Dalton or the Elliott or the Talk Cutoff at 2 a.m., is the kind of distance that changes what's possible. Stay safe out there. Keep your eyes on the road. And if something crosses your headlights at mile 227 at 3 a.m., something tall, something wrong, just keep driving. Don't look in the mirror. This is Mr. Darkveil. If these stories reached something in you, hit subscribe. There's more darkness where this came from. And if you've got a road story of your own, drop it in the comments. I read everyone.